I blocked my mum's phone. My son laughed while holding his wine glass and told his wealthy guests that blocking my number was the easiest way to get some peace. I sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He thought he was just ignoring a lonely widow, but he had no idea those 17 missed calls were trying to tell him that I now owned the company he was desperate to impress. My name is Eleanor Briggs. I am 62 years old, and for the last 7 years, since my husband Thomas passed away, I have lived alone in a small house on the edge of Denver that smells faintly of old paper and lavender. I used to manage administrative chaos at Northwind Community Services, keeping track of every donation and volunteer hour. But tonight, in the gleaming dining room of my son's house, I felt less significant than the linen napkin resting on my lap. Ethan and his wife, Marissa, were hosting a dinner for her colleagues. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the city lights. I was seated at the very end of the long mahogany table, right next to the swinging door that led to the kitchen. Every time the caterers moved in or out, a draft of cold air hit my ankles. It was the seat you gave to a child you were hoping would stay quiet, or an elderly relative you were hoping would disappear. Marissa was midway through a story about work-life balance. She gestured with her fork, the diamond on her finger catching the chandelier light. She laughed lightly and said that some people just did not understand boundaries, especially when they had too much free time. Her eyes flickered briefly toward me before returning to her guests. Ethan took a sip of his red wine. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to keep up with a lifestyle that demands perfection. He set his glass down and shrugged. Honestly, I just blocked Mum's phone for a while, he said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. It is easier. The conversation stalled. A few guests offered polite, uncomfortable chuckles. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold. I stared fixedly at the floral centerpiece, pretending my hearing aid was acting up, pretending I had not heard my only child admit to erasing me from his digital life because it was convenient. A man in a grey suit, one of Marissa's partners, swirled his drink and asked, "Who keeps calling that much anyway?" Ethan did not even look at me. "Just spam calls and Mum. Same difference," he said. The table erupted in laughter. It was a release of tension for them. But for me, it was a physical blow. I gripped the stem of my wine glass so hard I thought it might snap. Spam. I was just noise to him now. Unwanted noise. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed against my hip. It was a vibration I had felt several times a day for the past 2 weeks. I knew without looking that it was the unknown number again. I could not answer it here. If I pulled my phone out, I would just prove their point that I was obsessed with technology I did not understand. I waited for the main course to be cleared, then murmured an excuse and slipped out through the glass doors to the balcony. The night air was biting. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen glowed in the darkness. 17 missed calls in the last 10 days, all from the same number. No voicemail left. I pressed the call button, my thumb hovering over the unknown digits. Silence. Then a flat mechanical tone indicating the call could not be completed as dialed. A strange unease settled in my stomach, heavier than the rich food I had barely touched. Why would a spam caller be so persistent but unreachable? I slid the glass door open just enough to slip back inside. I intended to find Ethan, to ask him privately why he felt the need to block me, to ask him if I was really such a burden. But as I passed the hallway near the powder room, I heard Marissa's voice. She was holding her phone up, FaceTiming her mother. "Do not worry," Marissa said. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I told Ethan to handle his mother. She will not cause trouble tonight. She barely understands what is happening half the time anyway." I stepped back into the shadows. I walked past them, straight into the guest bathroom, and locked the door. The silence in the tiled room was deafening. I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was grey. My dress was 3 years old. And my eyes looked frightened. I looked exactly like what they thought I was. A relic. But then, a thought cut through the humiliation. Ethan said he had blocked me. He had blocked me weeks ago. That meant the phone calls I had been making to him were not going through. But my phone kept ringing. If my son had blocked me, then who had been calling me 17 times? I washed my hands, the water running cold over my skin. I dried them on a towel that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I was going to find out who owned that number. I did not know it yet. But that decision was about to pull a thread that would unravel the perfect tapestry Ethan and Marissa had woven around themselves. I drove home in silence that night, the heater in my old sedan rattling against the Denver cold. The silence gave me too much time to think, and my mind drifted back to a place far away from crystal wine glasses and marble countertops. I grew up in a dust-choked town in Oklahoma, where the only inheritance anyone received was debt and bad knees. I left when I was 18, working double shifts at diners and motels until I met Thomas. He was a gentleman, an electrician who smelled of copper wire and sawdust. We moved to Denver with nothing but a few boxes and a belief that if we worked hard enough, our son would never have to worry about whether the heat would stay on through the winter. We were a team. Thomas worked 2 jobs, and I managed the office at Northwind Community Services by day and took inventory shifts at a warehouse by night. We put every extra dollar into a coffee tin labeled Ethan's Future. We never took vacations. We rarely ate out. We just worked, fueled by the absolute certainty that our sacrifice was purchasing a better life for our boy. Then came the accident. Thomas fell from a scaffolding on a job site during Ethan's senior year of college. The grief was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. But I did not have the luxury of collapsing under it. The tuition bills kept coming. I remember selling Thomas's truck, our only reliable vehicle, just to cover the final semester fees. I took the bus to work for 3 years after that, walking 4 blocks in the snow, telling myself it was worth it because Ethan was going to be something special. For a long time, I thought we were still a team, even with Thomas gone. Living alone in the quiet house, my lifeline was the telephone. Ethan used to call me 3 times a week from his dorm, rambling for an hour about his classes and his dreams. I lived for those calls. But slowly, the calls grew shorter. The vibrant stories turned into brief summaries. Then, he met Marissa. Marissa was sharp, beautiful, and worked in luxury real estate marketing. She spoke a language of assets and networking that I did not understand. After they started dating, the calls stopped being conversations and started feeling like scheduled maintenance. He would call every 2 weeks, on Sunday evenings, his voice distracted, clearly watching the clock. I remember the first time I met Marissa's family. It was at a rooftop cocktail party in Seattle to celebrate their engagement. I wore my best dress, a navy blue piece I had bought at a department store sale, and polished my sensible black heels. I felt confident until I saw Caroline Hale, Marissa's mother. She was draped in cashmere and pearls, holding a flute of champagne like it was an extension of her hand. I watched her eyes scan me. She looked at my shoes, then my dress, then my face. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were arctic. She treated me like a hired act that had stayed too long on stage. Later that evening, I was standing near a decorative pillar, hidden by a large fern, when I heard Caroline whispering to Marissa. I froze. "If he wants to enter this class," she had hissed, low and venomous, "he has to learn to leave his mother behind. She is nice enough, I suppose, but she does not fit. Marissa, you cannot drag that kind of baggage into our world." I should have walked out. I should have caused a scene. Instead, I stayed silent. I stayed silent because I wanted my son to have peace. I convinced myself that if I just made myself smaller, if I occupied less space, they would eventually accept me. Sitting in my small living room now, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I realized how foolish I had been. Every time I accepted a seat at the edge of the table, every time I took an Uber home so they would not have to drive me, every time I swallowed an insult, I was not keeping the peace. I was helping them erase me. I looked down at my phone lying on the coffee table. Thomas used to check it every night to make sure it was charged, worried I might need him. Now, the son we sacrificed everything for had blocked my number because my desire to hear his voice was an inconvenience to his social climbing. I asked myself if I had done something wrong, or if my only crime was becoming old and poor in a world that worshipped youth and wealth. The screen lit up again. Another missed call from the unknown number. I was done being passive. I was done being blocked. Ethan might have cut off my line to him, but he could not control who was trying to reach me. Tomorrow morning, I would go to the mobile carrier store. I would get the call logs. I would find out who was on the other end of that line. For the first time in years, I was going to stop waiting for permission to exist and start demanding answers. The mobile carrier store was wedged between a discount shoe outlet and a vape shop in a strip mall about 3 miles from my house. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale popcorn. The girl behind the counter had purple streaks in her hair and tapped her long acrylic nails on the glass surface, looking at me with the kind of exhausted patience reserved for elderly customers who cannot find their email app. "I need to see my call history," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am the account holder." She sighed and asked for my ID. While she typed, she glanced up and asked if I was having trouble with the bill. "No," I said. "My son blocked my number on his phone because he says I call too much. But my phone keeps ringing from a number I do not recognize, and I cannot pick it up in time. I need to know who it is." The girl stopped typing. Her expression shifted from annoyance to something softer, something like pity mixed with indignation. She looked at me, really looked at me, and then turned the screen slightly. "That is not right," she murmured. "Let me print this out for you." A minute later, a warm sheet of paper slid across the counter. There it was, the same number, repeated 17 times in the last 14 days. I ran my finger down the list. They called mostly during business hours, between 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. But there were a few desperation attempts logged at 6 or 7 in the evening. I pulled out my mobile phone and tried to dial the number from the store. It rang once, then cut to a dead signal. I looked at the girl helplessly. It happens sometimes with high-security lines or switchboards that do not accept incoming calls from mobile numbers that are not in their registry, she explained. Or maybe they just have a block on return calls. You could try from a different line. A landline might work better if it is a business. I thanked her and walked out into the grey daylight. My heart was hammering a rhythm against my ribs that I could not quite interpret. Fear, hope. I walked 2 doors down to a small bakery cafe that I knew still kept a courtesy phone on the counter for takeout orders. I bought a cup of black coffee I did not want just to justify using the phone. The device was heavy, made of beige plastic that felt greasy to the touch. I dialed the number from the printout, reading the digits carefully. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Whitestone Legal and Trust, Executive Offices. A man's voice answered. It was deep, polished, and carried the distinct, clipped accent of the East Coast. I froze. A law firm. Why would a law firm be calling me 17 times? Hello, the voice said again. I cleared my throat. I am returning a call from this number, I said, my voice trembling slightly. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. May I ask who is calling? I hesitated. If this was a debt collector, or some liability from Thomas's old medical bills, I did not want to walk into a trap. But curiosity was stronger than fear. I am calling about the number ending in 4099. The man's tone sharpened instantly into professional alertness. Is this Mrs. Eleanor Briggs? We have been trying to reach a Mrs. Eleanor Briggs for 2 weeks. My hand gripped the receiver so tight my knuckles turned white. I did not answer. Yes. Instead, I asked, what is this regarding? The man sighed, a sound of professional relief. Ma'am, if this is Mrs. Briggs, I need you to confirm we are approaching a strict legal deadline regarding the execution of a trust and estate matter. I am the senior assistant to the executor for the estate of Mr. Adrian Cole. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The air in the cafe seemed to vanish. Adrian Cole. 30 years ago. Adrian had been the program director at Northwind Community Services. He was brilliant, kind, and the only man other than Thomas who had ever looked at me as if I were the most interesting person in the room. We had been close, dancing on the edge of something that might have been love, until a financial scandal erupted at the non-profit. It was a setup, blamed on him to protect a board member. He was forced to resign and leave Denver in disgrace. I had been the only one who believed him, the only one who defended him. But he left to spare me from the fallout. Adrian Cole, I whispered. He left strict instructions that we were to find you, the assistant said, his voice softening. He was very specific. Mrs. Briggs. He said you were the only person to contact regarding the discretionary execution of his final wishes. But we have been getting a busy signal or no answer on your mobile for weeks. We assumed... Well, we were worried we were too late. I looked at the receiver in my hand. I looked at the printout on the cafe table. Ethan. My son had told his dinner guests he blocked me to stop the spam. He had laughed about it. But in his arrogance, in his haste to silence his mother, he had silenced the only channel through which the past was trying to rescue my future. I am Eleanor Briggs, I said, my voice finding a new steeliness I did not know I possessed. And I am listening. I returned to my small house and went straight to the bedroom closet. I pulled down a heavy cardboard box that had been sitting on the top shelf for years, taped shut and gathering dust. Inside were the remnants of my career at Northwind Community Services. I sifted through stacks of old newsletters, meeting minutes, and holiday cards until my fingers found a manila envelope at the bottom. Inside was a black and white photograph. It was from an awards ceremony 30 years ago, Standing next to me, looking young and impossibly hopeful, was Adrian Cole. He was smiling that soft, self-effacing smile that always made me feel safe. Looking at his face, the years peeled away, and I was back in that cramped office, smelling the stale coffee and feeling the terror that had gripped us both. Adrian had been the program director, and the board of directors had decided he was the perfect scapegoat for a $50,000 shortfall in the construction fund. They were going to send him to prison. Everyone turned their backs on him. Everyone except me. I had spent 3 weeks staying late, copying ledgers, tracing the paper trail until I found the proof that the embezzlement had come from a board member, not Adrian. I presented the evidence in a closed-door meeting. They agreed to drop the charges against Adrian to keep the scandal quiet, but they demanded his resignation anyway. He was innocent, but he was ruined in Denver before he left for New York. He slipped a letter into my coat pocket. I found it now, folded inside a plastic sleeve behind the photograph. The ink was fading, but the handwriting was sharp and decisive. It read, "Eleanor, you saved my life when no one else would look at me. If the universe allows it, I will repay this debt, not with a check, but by protecting what you cherish most when you cannot protect it yourself." I had kept that letter as a memento of a good deed, never expecting it to be anything more. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my laptop. The cooling fan whirred noisily as I typed Whitestone Legal and Trust into the search bar, followed by Adrian Cole. The results filled the screen. My breath caught in my throat. Adrian had not just survived, he had thrived. He had become a legendary consultant for private philanthropy, the man billionaires called when they wanted to give away their fortunes quietly. One article titled "The Silent Architect of Philanthropy" described him as a man who lived simply but controlled billions in charitable assets. Then I saw the obituary. Adrian had died 3 weeks ago from heart failure. He had never married. He had no children. The article mentioned that the bulk of his estate would form a private foundation dedicated to the quiet heroes of his past. I looked away from the screen, my eyes stinging. The 17 missed calls. The assistant said they were running out of time. My son, in his arrogance, had looked at a name he did not recognize and decided it was trash. He had almost thrown away the fulfillment of a 30-year-old promise because he thought he knew better than his mother. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom door. I looked at the woman reflected there. I saw the wrinkles, the cheap cardigan, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime apologizing for taking up space. I thought about the power Adrian might have left me. Was it money? Was it a donation to a charity of my choice? I realized then that I was standing at a crossroads. One path was the high road, using whatever this was to simply do good works and fade into the background. The other path was darker. It was the path of a woman who was tired of being laughed at during dinner parties. I wanted to help people. Yes. But as I thought about Marissa's cold smile and Ethan's dismissal, a spark of something hot and sharp ignited in my chest. I did not just want to be generous. I wanted to be formidable. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Whitestone Legal again. "This is Eleanor Briggs," I said when the assistant answered. "I am ready to hear what Adrian left for me." There was a pause, and then the assistant connected me to the senior executor. The lawyer's voice was grave and respectful. He explained that Adrian had established the Silver Line Horizons Foundation. He had named me as the sole trustee with veto power over its investments. And then came the revelation that made the room spin. The lawyer explained that the primary asset of the foundation was a controlling block of preferred stock in a specific corporation, acquired strategically by Adrian over the last decade. The foundation owned 18% of the Hale Stratus Group. I gripped the phone. Hale Stratus Group. That was the real estate empire owned by Marissa's family. It was the source of Caroline Hale's arrogance, the reason Marissa felt she could treat me like a servant, and the ladder my son was so desperate to climb. Adrian had not just left me money. He had handed me the leash to the monster that was eating my family. I hung up the phone and looked at my hands. They were shaking, not with fear, but with the terrifying realization that for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the weapon. 2 days later, I stepped out of an elevator onto the 45th floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan. It was my first time leaving Denver in over a decade, and the sheer vertical scale of New York made me feel dizzy. The offices of Whitestone Legal and Trust were terrifyingly beautiful. Everything was made of polished chrome and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a view of the Hudson River. I looked down at my shoes. They were sensible black flats I had bought at a discount store 3 years ago, and against the pristine white carpet of the reception area, they looked like dirty smudges. I tried to tuck my feet under the chair while I waited, wishing I could disappear. Then the double doors opened, and a woman walked out. She was tall, African American, perhaps in her 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. She extended a hand to me. "I am Cassandra Price," she said. Her grip was firm, her eyes warm but assessing. She did not look at my shoes. She looked at my face. We sat in a corner office that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. Cassandra wasted no time with pleasantries. She opened a thick leather binder and slid it across the marble table toward me. "Adrian Cole did not just leave you money. Eleanor," she said, her voice precise. "He left you a weapon." I stared at her, confused. She explained that the trust Adrian had created, the Silverline Horizons Foundation, was not just a charitable piggy bank. It was an active investment vehicle. Adrian had spent the last 10 years of his life quietly acquiring preferred stock in a specific conglomerate. Silverline Horizons currently holds 18% of the voting shares in the Hale Stratus Group, Cassandra said. And as the sole trustee, you hold the proxy for those votes. The room seemed to tilt. Hale Stratus Group. That was Caroline Hale's empire. That was the company Marissa worked for. The company Ethan was desperate to partner with. Cassandra leaned forward. "Adrian kept tabs on you, Eleanor. He knew you were living modestly. He knew when your son married into the Hale family. He knew the reputation of the Hale Stratus Group, how they buy up affordable housing blocks and evict the elderly to build luxury condos. He suspected that sooner or later, you would become a casualty of their ambition. He designed this trust as a shield." I sat back, my heart pounding against my ribs. The irony was suffocating. Ethan had blocked my calls to keep me from embarrassing him in front of the very people whose future I now held in my hands. He had silenced the phone that was ringing to tell him his mother was no longer a liability, but a kingmaker. Cassandra laid out 2 options. I could be a silent partner, take the dividends, donate them to charity, and let the Hales continue their business as usual. Or I could call for an extraordinary shareholder meeting to review the company's ethical compliance regarding vulnerable demographics. Panic rose in my throat. "I am just a 62-year-old widow," I stammered. "I do not know anything about corporate governance. I balance my checkbook at the kitchen table. I cannot walk into a boardroom and tell billionaires what to do. Cassandra shook her head firmly. Power is not about understanding the intricacies of the stock market. Eleanor, power is knowing exactly what you will no longer accept. You do not need to know how to build the building to know when the foundation is rotten. I looked out the window at the city below. I thought about the dinner party. I thought about being seated by the kitchen door. I thought about Ethan saying it was easier to block me. If he knew that the annoying mother he tried to erase was the one person who could veto his wife's next big project, what would he do? Would he look at me with respect, or just fear? I turned back to Cassandra. What do you suggest? We do not do this quietly, she said, a small, sharp smile touching her lips. The Hale Stratus Group is hosting a major gala next week to launch their new project, Evermont Plaza. We time the shareholder meeting request to coincide with that. We force Caroline and Marissa to face you publicly. We use your voting bloc to demand a change in company bylaws regarding the treatment of the elderly and community stakeholders. I swallowed hard. I did not want to destroy them. I did not want Ethan to lose his job or his marriage. But I was tired of being invisible. I do not want revenge for the sake of cruelty, I said softly. I just want the truth to be spoken. I want respect to be mandatory, not optional. That is exactly what we will get, Cassandra promised. She pushed a pen toward me. I picked it up. My hand trembled as I hovered over the signature line of the acceptance documents. For a second, I hesitated, fear gripping me. But then I remembered the dial tone when I tried to call my son. I remembered the laughter at the dinner table. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed Eleanor Briggs in blue ink. Cassandra placed her hand over mine as I finished. You are shaking, she noted. I am terrified, I admitted. Good, she said. That means you understand the stakes. But look at that signature. Eleanor, that is not the signature of a victim. That is the signature of a woman who has started her counterattack. By the time my flight landed in Denver, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the tarmac. I turned off airplane mode, and my phone immediately began to convulse in my hand. It buzzed and pinged relentlessly for 2 solid minutes, a backlog of notifications flooding in all at once. I sat in the cramped economy seat and watched the names scroll by. Ethan? 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 Just 48 hours ago? I had been a ghost to him, a nuisance to be blocked and silenced. Now, 16 missed calls and 12 voicemails sat in my inbox. I did not call back immediately. Instead, I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table to listen to them in chronological order. The first message was annoyed. Mom, call me. There is some weird legal paperwork at the office with your name on it. The third message was confused. Mom, legal says you are a trustee for Silverline. That has to be a mistake. Call me. By the 10th message, the arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a thin, high-pitched panic I had not heard in his voice since he was a child, waking up from a nightmare. Mom, please. Caroline is losing her mind. You need to tell me what is going on. I learned later what had happened at the Hale Stratus headquarters while I was in the air. A courier from Whitestone Legal had delivered the notice of an extraordinary shareholder meeting. Caroline Hale had initially scoffed, tossing the folder onto her glass desk, assuming it was just another small investor looking for a payout. It was only when the head of her legal department rushed in, pale and sweating, that the reality struck. He pointed out that Silverline Horizons did not just hold stock, They held veto power over the entire Evermont Plaza development, the project that was supposed to make them billionaires. And then he pointed to the name on the signatory line, Eleanor Briggs. I finally returned Ethan's call and told him to meet me at a diner on Colfax Avenue. It was a place with vinyl seats patched with duct tape and coffee that tasted like burnt hazelnuts. It was the kind of place Marissa would never set foot in. Ethan arrived 20 minutes early. Seeing him sitting there was a jarring study in contrasts. He was wearing a charcoal Italian suit that likely cost more than the waitress made in 3 months. Yet he looked small against the cracked red booth. He was wringing his hands, his tie loosened, sweat beading on his forehead. When I slid into the booth opposite him, he looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Legal is saying you control 18% of the voting stock. They are saying you can stop the Evermont project. Mum, do you have any idea what is happening? Caroline is tearing the office apart." I calmly ordered a coffee from the waitress before looking at him. I told him everything. I told him about Adrian Cole, the man I saved 30 years ago. I told him about the trust. And then I told him about the calls. I told him that for 2 weeks. The executors of a multi-million-dollar estate had been trying to reach me to give me this power. They called 17 times. Ethan went still. The blood drained from his face, leaving him grey. "I tried to tell you," I said, keeping my voice even. "At dinner, when you and your friends were laughing." Ethan stared at his hands. His mouth opened and closed. "I thought, honestly, Mom, I just thought it was spam. I thought you were calling to chat about nothing, and the other calls were just robocalls. I blocked it to get some peace." He looked up, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had blocked the call that would have saved his career. He had silenced the very thing that now held a knife to his wife's company. "I did not know," he whispered. "You did not know because you decided I was not worth listening to." I said, "You did not just block a phone number. Ethan, you blocked the possibility that your mother was a person with a history, with value, and with connections you could not understand. You blocked my dignity because it was inconvenient for your new life." He tried to stammer an apology, something about stress and pressure, but I raised my hand. He stopped instantly. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight that had never been there before. "We are not going to do this the old way," I said. "You are not going to apologize to make the problem go away so you can go back to pleasing Marissa. If you want to talk to me, really talk to me, we are going to do it right now. But we are going to speak as 2 adults standing on equal ground. I am not your charity case anymore. Ethan, I am the woman who decides if your project gets built. So, take a breath. And tell me if you are ready to have a conversation with your mother, or if you want to leave and explain to your wife why you failed." I looked across the chipped laminate table at my son and decided that protecting his feelings was no longer my job. I told him exactly what I had heard that night at his dinner party. I described the laughter of his guests. I repeated his words back to him, syllable for syllable. I told him how he had sat there, swirling his expensive wine, and told a room full of strangers that he had blocked his mother because it was easier than dealing with her. I told him how I had felt sitting by the kitchen door, like a servant who had been allowed to stay only out of pity. Ethan shifted in the booth, his defensive instincts flaring up. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and told me I did not understand the pressure he was under. He said he had to maintain a certain image for the Hale family and their clients. He admitted that when I called him during the day, or when his phone lit up with my name during meetings, he felt a spike of anxiety. He said he was terrified that his colleagues would see him as a man tethered to old, needy family baggage instead of a sharp, independent executive. I let the silence stretch between us for a moment before I asked him a simple question. I asked him if he had felt embarrassed by my baggage when I was signing the loan papers for his tuition. I asked him if my presence was inconvenient when I worked double shifts to pay for his first car, or when I stayed up nights helping him study for his finals. Ethan stopped moving. He stared at the table, his face pale. I asked him why my calls were a nuisance now, when my signature on a check had always been welcome. That was the moment he broke. The polished veneer of the successful businessman cracked, and I saw the frightened boy underneath. He admitted that he had let Marissa and Caroline define what was valuable in his world. To them, value was measured in assets, connections, and pedigree. I did not have any of those things, so in his mind, I had become a liability. Tears welled up in his eyes and spilled over. It was rare to see him cry. He confessed that sometimes, when he saw my worn shoes or thought about our small, drafty house in the old neighborhood. He felt a deep, burning shame. He had wanted to scrub the poverty off his skin, and blocking my number was just another way of trying to distance himself from where he came from. I watched him weep, but I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not offer him a napkin. I needed him to sit in that discomfort. I told him that I did not need him to fall apart. I needed him to take responsibility. Blocking me was a choice he made. Remaining silent while his wife and mother-in-law treated me like furniture was a choice he made. I laid out my condition clearly. I told him that he had to face Marissa and Caroline. He had to tell them exactly who I was and where I stood in his life. And he had to do it not because I held the proxy for 18% of their company, and not because he was afraid of losing the deal. He had to do it because it was the right thing to do. Ethan looked up at me, terror in his eyes. He whispered that if he stood up for me now, against the Evermont project, they would see it as a betrayal. It could destroy his marriage. It could end his career at Hale Stratus. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the golden cage he had built for himself was still a cage. I leaned forward and reminded him of his father. I told him that when Thomas died, I had a choice. I could have kept Ethan close, kept him at home to fill the silence of that empty house. Instead, I pushed him to go to college. I pushed him to leave me, because I knew it was best for him. Every choice has a price, I said. I paid mine in loneliness for years. Now it is time for you to pay the price for your choices. Ethan stared at his cold cup of coffee for a long time. When he finally looked at me, the arrogance was gone. He looked at me not as his mother, but as a woman he was just beginning to meet. He nodded slowly, his voice shaky but distinct. He promised me that he would come to the shareholder meeting. He said he would stand there not as Marissa's husband, and not as my son, but as a man who was finally ready to decide for himself what kind of person he wanted to be. The extraordinary shareholder meeting of the Hale Stratus Group took place in the Crystal Ballroom of a historic luxury hotel in downtown Seattle. It was the same day they had planned to unveil the Evermont Plaza project to the world. So the room was packed not just with nervous investors, but with financial bloggers, industry analysts, and the flashing cameras of the press. The air smelled of expensive coffee and aggressive ambition. I walked into the room wearing a deep green dress I had bought at a department store downtown, paired with a well-tailored coat and a pair of new, sensible shoes that did not pinch my toes. I walked beside Cassandra Price, my head held high. I did not look for Ethan. I did not look for a seat in the back, near the kitchen. Today, I walked straight to the reserved row at the front. Caroline and Marissa had clearly choreographed the event to minimize the damage. Their strategy was to treat the Silverline Horizons Foundation as a silent, benevolent partner, a prop to make their corporate image look softer. On stage, Marissa was dazzling in a cream-colored suit, speaking into a headset microphone about community pillars and the company's dedication to social responsibility. She clicked a remote, and a slide appeared showing smiling elderly actors in a staged park setting. She spoke about how the Evermont Plaza would feature spaces for all generations. Sitting there, I felt a cold knot of anger in my stomach. This was the same woman who had told her mother that I needed to be kept in the background. This was the same woman who had mocked my need for connection as a lack of boundaries. The hypocrisy was so thick, it tasted like ash in my mouth. When the presentation concluded, Caroline took the podium. She smiled that practiced, Arctic smile, and announced that they were honored to have a representative from their strategic partner, the Silverline Horizons Foundation, to give a few remarks on their shared charitable vision. She gestured to Cassandra, expecting the lawyer to come up, say a few vague words about synergy, and sit down. Cassandra stood up, but she did not move toward the stairs. Instead, she accepted the handheld microphone from a floor attendant and spoke clearly. The voice of Silverline Horizons today is not mine. It belongs to the sole trustee and the holder of our voting proxy. I yield the floor to Mrs. Eleanor Briggs. A ripple of confusion went through the room. I stood up. As I climbed the stairs to the stage, I saw the recognition dawn on the faces of a few people in the front row guests who had been at Ethan's dinner party, the ones who had laughed when he said he blocked my phone. Their jaws went slack. I stepped behind the podium, behind me. The massive screen changed. The generic logo was replaced by my name, Eleanor Briggs, followed by the text, Key Veto Holder, Silverline Horizons Foundation. The camera flashes erupted like a lightning storm. I waited for the murmurs to die down. I did not shout. I spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who has spent 30 years keeping other people's lives in order. I told them briefly about my time at Northwind Community Services. I told them about Adrian Cole, a man who was almost destroyed by a system that valued money over truth, and how he had left me this power not to make me rich, but to ensure that people like us were never again treated as disposable. I looked down at the papers Cassandra had prepared. Then I looked up at the investors. I announced that Silverline Horizons was prepared to vote in favor of the Evermont Plaza project, but only under specific conditions. We required the Hale Stratus Group to sign a legally binding commitment to overhaul their policies regarding the treatment of elderly employees and community stakeholders. Furthermore, I demanded the immediate establishment of the Elder Dignity Initiative, a permanent fund financed by 1% of the gross profits of the Evermont project, dedicated to legal aid for seniors facing financial abuse. The room was silent. Caroline looked as if she had been struck. Marissa was trembling. I stepped away from the microphone, but I did not leave the stage. I walked over to where Caroline and Marissa were standing. The cameras were zooming in, the microphones on the podium picking up the ambient sound. I looked them in the eye, and I spoke loud enough for the recording devices to catch every syllable. "And this is my personal condition," I said, my voice steady. "I am the mother who was placed at the edge of the table. I am the woman whose calls were blocked because they were inconvenient. From today on, when this company speaks about family values in its press releases, you will not define family by the number of zeros in a bank account. You will define it by how you treat the people who can no longer offer you a profit." I turned back to the crowd. The silence stretched for an agonizing 5 seconds. Then, a single person started clapping. Then another. Soon. The sound swelled into a roar of applause, heavy and demanding. I pulled the contract from my folder and slid it across the lectern toward Caroline. She looked at the cheering crowd, then at the stock ticker on the side screen, and finally at me. She realized she had no choice. If she refused, I would use my veto. The project would die, and her stock would crash by morning. With a hand that shook visibly, Caroline Hale picked up the pen and signed the paper. Marissa followed suit, her eyes lowered, unable to meet my gaze. They had just signed away a portion of their empire to the woman they had tried to erase, and the world was applauding them for it. The headlines the next morning were relentless. The Seattle Times ran a piece titled "The Widow Who Woke Up the Boardroom," while a popular financial blog simply called it "The Silver Line Shock." My face, captured in high definition as I stood at the podium, was plastered across screens from Denver to New York. I looked at the image of myself, a 62-year-old woman in a department store dress, staring down a billion-dollar corporation, and for the first time in years, I did not see a relic. I saw a force of nature. Ethan read the articles sitting on the edge of the sofa in my hotel room. He had come over after dinner, knocking on my door with a hesitation that was entirely new. For years, his visits felt like obligations, rushed check-ins where he checked his watch every 5 minutes. Tonight, he knocked like a man asking for permission to enter a space he finally understood he did not own. He scrolled through the comments on his phone, reading aloud the praise from strangers. He told me that the internal Slack channels at Hale Stratus were exploding. Caroline was reportedly in a blind rage, shattering a vase in her executive suite, while Marissa was locked in her office, terrified that any wrong move now would turn the public against her permanently. They could not attack me. The narrative was too perfect, and the public support was too strong. Ethan put the phone down and looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed. He confessed that part of him was proud, but a bigger part was ashamed. He admitted that he realized the respect I was getting now had nothing to do with him. I had earned it on my own, with the help of a man who saw my worth 30 years ago, while my own son had been too busy apologizing for my existence. He looked out the window at the city lights and said something that made the air in the room still. He told me that if I had not walked onto that stage with the power of the trust behind me, he probably would not have had the courage to stand up to Caroline. He admitted he was weak. But seeing me up there, steady and shaking at the same time, reminded him of something his father used to say. Thomas used to tell him that I was small, but I was the toughest person in the house because I never let the world break me. I looked at my hands and shared a memory with him. I reminded him of when he was 10 years old and wanted to play baseball until dark. Thomas had made a rule that Ethan had to call home every single time he was going to be late, just so I would not worry. Thomas taught him that checking in was an act of love. I looked at Ethan and let the silence hang heavy between us. Somewhere along the way, That act of love had become a burden so heavy he had to block it out to find peace. Ethan flinched. He asked me quietly if I intended to use this power to destroy the Hale family. He asked if I was going to burn his life down. I shook my head. I told him that I had no interest in destruction. I just wanted them to understand what it felt like to be placed at the back of the line. I told him I would not destroy him because, despite everything, he was still the son Thomas and I raised. He was the legacy of a good man, and I refused to give up on that. But I set 2 boundaries. They were not requests. I told him that he was going to arrange a dinner at his house. At this dinner, I would sit in the center of the table, not near the kitchen door, and not in the corner. I would be the guest of honor in the home my sacrifices helped build. Second, I told him he had to speak to Marissa. He had to tell her that he was standing by me not because I controlled the stock, and not because he was afraid of losing money. He had to tell her he was choosing his mother because it was the moral choice. If she could not accept that, then he had to be willing to accept the consequences of her shallow heart. Ethan swallowed hard. He understood what I was asking. I was not asking him to divorce his wife. I was asking him to divorce his fear. I was asking him to choose between being a man with a spine and a man who lived in terror of being judged by people who only loved him when he was winning. When he left my room an hour later, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I watched him walk down the hallway, his shoulders slightly slumped, but his step heavier, more grounded. I knew the hardest realization for him wasn't that I had the power to veto his project. It was the crushing understanding that in his desperation to climb the social ladder, he had blocked the number of the one person in the world who had been standing in his corner all along. 3 weeks later, my sedan pulled into the driveway of Ethan's house. This time, there were no luxury SUVs lining the curb, and no caterers rushing in and out with trays of hors d'oeuvres. It was just family. I carried a homemade apple pie in my hands, still warm from my oven, the crust uneven and smelling of cinnamon. It felt like I was carrying a piece of my old life into their sterile world. But this time, I was not hiding it. When I walked into the dining room, the change was immediate. The long mahogany table had been shortened, the extra leaves removed so that it felt like a place for conversation rather than a boardroom. My place setting was right in the middle, directly across from the centerpiece. Resting on my plate was the heavy, embroidered linen napkin that Marissa usually saved for her most important investors. Marissa walked in from the kitchen. She stopped when she saw me. She looked different. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing jeans and a simple beige sweater. The armor of heavy makeup and designer silk was gone, leaving her looking younger and far more anxious. She did not look like a winner today. She looked like a woman trying to figure out if she still had a place in her own home. We sat down, and the silence was thick. But it was not the icy silence of exclusion. It was the heavy silence of people waiting for the truth. Ethan spoke first. He looked at Marissa, then at me, and he laid it all out. He told her everything about Adrian, the will, and the shareholder meeting. But then he stopped and took a breath. He told her that the moment that haunted him was not when the company was forced to sign the agreement. It was the moment he had bragged to his friends that he had blocked his mother's number. Marissa looked down at her plate, her eyes filling with tears. She admitted quietly that she had pushed him to distance himself from me. She told us that she grew up in a house where your background was your resume, and anything that looked like poverty was a stain that could ruin your future. She had trained herself to put image before emotion, and she had dragged Ethan into that same cold logic. I listened, but I did not rush to smooth things over. I looked at her and told her that apologizing because she was afraid of losing face was not the same as apologizing because she had devalued a human being. I told her I did not need to make peace just to protect my shares in her company, because those shares were not a weapon. They were just a reminder that people like me have the right to say enough is enough. Then came the moment that changed everything. Ethan looked at his wife, his voice steady and loud in the quiet room. He told her that even if the Silverline Foundation pulled every penny of funding tomorrow, he would never block my number again. He told her that if she saw his loyalty to his mother as a weakness, then perhaps they needed to have a serious conversation about what their marriage was actually built on. Marissa went very still. She looked at Ethan as if she was seeing him for the first time in years. After a long minute, she nodded. She said she needed time to unlearn the way she had been raised. She asked if we could start small. She promised that I would never sit at the end of the table again. And she asked me to tell her about Thomas. She wanted to know about the man who raised the husband she had almost lost. The consequences of that month rippled out slowly. The next shareholder meeting confirmed the new agreement with Silverline. Hale Stratus began implementing real community programs for the elderly, monitored strictly by my lawyers. Caroline Hale was forced to release a video apologizing for her past remarks regarding age in the workplace. She did not say my name, but everyone in the industry knew exactly who she was talking to. It was humiliating for her, but it was necessary. Months later, I was sitting in my living room in Denver. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. My phone buzzed on the side table. I picked it up. The screen did not say, "Unknown caller." It did not go straight to voicemail. It simply said, "Ethan." I answered it. "Mum, how was your day?" he asked. His voice was clear. There was no rushing, no hushed tones because he was in a meeting, no annoyance. It was just a son asking his mother about her life. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. I realized I did not need the world to love me. I did not need to destroy Caroline or Marissa to feel whole. I just needed to stop accepting a seat at the back of the room. The line that had once been blocked was now open, a simple, durable thread connecting me to the future, deep in my heart. I whispered to the man who had started it all. "I heard you, Adrian," and I answered in my own way. Thanks so much for listening to my story. And I would love to hear where you guys are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people.